After waiting for like, I don't know, what felt decades locked inside the tomb, Pharaoh is finally becoming a full-scale historical title, going from a glorified saga to something you might actually want to play all the time. Now, they've announced 4 new cultures and a massive map expansion, and now we're gonna take a look at the possible playable factions with the expanded map. Now, they haven't been revealed fully, so for all we know, there might be more than 4 playables, so let's explore some very likely candidates here. Now, I'm gonna separate the factions based on location and see what has the biggest chance of being playable from both a historical and interesting gameplay point of view. Before we continue with the list, tell me which faction and historical character are you looking forward to the most? Write it in the comments. The Western Desert got expanded along the coastline, so not only does this mean the threat from Libyans increases, but we also have space for at least one playable faction. And now we have 3 options here. First, the most obvious, the Libu. The problem with this is that there are no named Libyan characters of the time frame outside of King Merye, but unfortunately the dude got killed a few years before the game starts at the Battle of Perire. CA could bring him back from the dead. I mean, hey, what's a little necromancy between friends, you know? I mean, look at Kurunta. He should be decaying in the ground by now, but look at the dude, he's looking like a fresh young 90. The Libu native roster is pretty good actually, and it wouldn't be hard to create some new faction units for a full experience. On the other hand, we have a likelier candidate. Setnachte, the founder of the 20th dynasty, the father of Ramses III, the guy who kicked Tausret and Irsu's asses, yep, the one and only. Now, I know what you're thinking, another Egyptian faction in an overpopulated area, but here's the reason. There's data mined art of him in the game files, so they were planning him at some point, it's obvious, and now that the map is expanded directly next to him, you know, 2 and 2 equals 4, he could bring an interesting twist with unique Libyan units. Or if he shares the roster with the rest of the Egyptians, he could just have an easier access to the Libu, and also, he's closer to Greece. So if you want to spice your campaign up, yeah, sandbox enjoyers, I'm talking to you. And option number 3 is, why not both? Now, when it comes to Greece, we do have some important palatial centers and personal names from both Hittite sources and Linear B, but not all of them perfectly match the time frame. So it's pretty much guaranteed we'll see Mycenae as the leading Greek faction. I mean, come on, let's be real here. When you think about Bronze Age Greece, you're thinking of Agamemnon, Achilles, all the characters from the Iliad, so I won't be surprised if Agamemnon ends up being the Mycenaean king. Yes, this is supposed to be a historical game, but there's a high chance that both the Greeks and Trojans will be heavily influenced by their previous appearance in Troy, when it comes to both characters and units. I mean, come on, it's free real estate, the assets are there. Now the question is, could there be more than one Greek faction? Pylos and Laconia are just a javelin's throw away, so that would make the Peloponnesus kinda cluttered, but out of those, as an example, Pylos is a great candidate. From a historical point, it was a very important palatial center, and Nestor's palace is the most preserved palace we have. He could even be the leader, assuming they're taking another page out of the Troy book. But there's another place where we can look for a playable character, and hear me out here, this is a wild card, but it could totally work. Trust, okay? Ithaca. I know what you're thinking, Iliad, Odyssey, it's a story, blah blah blah, but listen, just like with most Greek myths, there has to be some basis on reality. Not only would a Western island position give a different gameplay experience, but his roster could also be similar to his Troy representation. You know, focus on guerrilla warfare, hard-hitting troops, and adding some extra sea people flavor. Let's not forget that some sea people came from the Ionian coast, and one of the Sheridan origin theories also places him there. Oh yeah, and there's the Odysseus raid on Egypt mentioned in the Odyssey, so if you want to recreate that epic experience, I think this could be a great addition from a gameplay point of view. Thrace is also one of the new regions added on the map, but let's be realistic here. There are no named characters associated with this geographical area outside of Rhesus, who is a mythical character, so I doubt there's any chance of Thracians getting their own playable faction. But adding recruitable natives is totally possible, as they had their own faction in Troy, so it's as easy as adding as existing assets. Speaking of Troy, it's time to take a look at it, or its real name, Vilusha. It's confirmed playable. So the question is, will it be unified or split up into different factions? Now, a unified approach lets them combine multiple faction armies like Aeneas and Hector, but it doesn't really give us much in terms of starting position diversity. Who would be the faction leader? Will they search through historical Luvian names, as we have records of several Trojan kings, or will they stick to the good old Iliad characters such as Priam? Time will tell, but I kinda have a feeling we're gonna be seeing a lot more Iliad content than we should. Now that we're in Anatolia, we have possibilities for another playable faction or two, cause the area is huge and it needs to be filled up. Hear me out here, they are kinda wild cards, but they do make perfect sense. The Lycians, or the Lukawani in their native tongue, were vassals of the Hittites, yet many times throughout their history they rebelled against Hittite rule. I wonder why. They allied with the Arzavans and other Luvians multiple times against the Hittites, and sometimes they were listed as real enemies of the state. Now, we don't have records of any named ruler during the time frame of the Bronze Age collapse. They're mentioned as one of the Sea People groups, and they were active pirates in the region for at least a few centuries before the game starts. If they're added as a playable faction, their roster should be a mix of Arzawan and Sea People units, out of which some, that are currently in the game, have Lycian flavor text, such as the Marauding Axe Chargers. Sarpedon as a faction leader is pure fiction, but considering they've got all the assets from Troy, I can actually see this scenario happening. Kashkians, the ancient enemies of the Hittites. So for centuries, these guys have raided Hittite forts and settlements, and they even served in their armies as mercenaries or settled troops at times. It was this warlike people that eventually burned Hattusha to the ground. Now that northern Anatolia is completely on the map, it only makes sense to add these fierce tribes to the game as a playable faction. They have a very good amount of native units, they can be made into a full faction roster, and we need more nomads. And speaking of the Hittites, now with the expanded map into Mesopotamia, there's a flawless candidate, Carchemish. It was an extremely important royal Hittite city which outlived the fall of the proper Hittite kingdom and existed well into the Iron Age. Ramses III campaigned against the king of Carchemish as an example, and that shows that the city still wielded political power during the collapse. It's basically so close to Assyria, and thanks to the Great Rivers, you can easily end up fighting for control of all of Mesopotamia. A great choice. The Levant also has one candidate that should have been playable from the beginning, but you know, now's better than ever. Ugarit. The city of the White Harbor, one of the biggest, if not the biggest, coastal Mediterranean trade hubs, connecting east and west with trade. At this time, it will be ruled by Amurapi, the last king before Ugarit's destruction at the hands of the same people. Yeah, the very same guy that Shupiluluuma scolds in his letter for knowing nothing. Yeah, apparently the Jon Snow of the Bronze Age. We have a very good overview about Ugaritic military thanks to a multitude of tablets found at the archaeological site of Ras Shamra. We know so much about their extremely rich and decorated Marianu and deadly archers. Strategically, it's a great location to expand into the east or fight for your life against the Sea People. Yeah, win-win. Remember when I said the game needs more playable nomads? And what's better to add with a map expansion towards Mesopotamia than the Alamu and Sutians? They served as mercenaries in the various armies of Mesopotamia and Canaan for centuries. And during the Bronze Age collapse, many of these Arameans would overrun the Middle East and become a major player on the stage. Even in the Iron Age, the infamous Chaldeans, a related group, migrated into southeast Mesopotamia and fought many wars against Assyria, and they even ended up ruling Babylon for a time. Now we're gonna look at one of the fan favorites, Assyria, and potential faction leaders. Tukulti-Ninurta, first of his name, the great king who continued the legacy of his father Shalmaneser. He conquered Babylon and asserted Assyrian dominance completely. He would be a fantastic choice, but there's only one problem. He's kinda dead, as in stabbed to death dead. Don't you just love it when one of your sons rebel? Necromancy is a solution, but sometimes something that is dead should stay dead, so we have a few options here. Assyria was going through a messy period after Tukulti-Ninurta's death. Most of his successors were a complete joke in comparison. Ashur-Nadin Apli seized the throne and ruled Assyria for a few years after the death of his father. He's the legitimate ruler, as legitimate as killing your own dad makes you. After him, we have a few weak kings, out of which Enlil-Kudurri-Ushur stands out as another example of incompetence. He was crushed by the Babylonians and deposed by Ninurta-Apal-Ekur, an interesting character who came from a long line of royal advisors to the Assyrian kings, the so-called Sukalu-Rabiu. Under his rule, Assyria was a force to be reckoned with again. Realistically, he would be the best faction leader because of all the intrigues you could do and the interesting story to his rise of power. Babylon suffered a great defeat at the hands of Tukulti-Ninurta and was effectively subjugated by Assyria for many years. With the support of the Akkadians, Adad Shuma Usur rebelled against the Assyrians. He humiliated them in battle and entrenched himself on the throne of Babylon. Some consider him the rightful heir and son of Kashtiliash IV, but others disputed his heritage. The Assyrians called him a son of a nobody, which was a common phrase for an usurper, or obviously lowborn in the literal sense. If we're looking for a Babylonian faction leader, it should be Adad Shuma Usur without a doubt, as he did break the Assyrian yoke and re-established the Kassite dynasty. And last but not least, you can't have Assyria and Babylon without Elam. For millennia, Elam has stood proud, famous for its high-quality metalworking, horned gods, their archers and swordsmen, and the savage warriors of the hinterlands. Elam has been a major player for the power struggle in Mesopotamia for centuries, trying to both usurp and dominate Babylon, while later countering the Assyrian influence. Even into the Iron Age, the Neo-Assyrians and Elamites still fought each other until Elam was greatly weakened and eventually destroyed. The best candidate for a faction leader would be Shutruk Nahunte, who established the Shutrukid dynasty and took Elam's power to new heights. He successfully invaded and sacked Babylon, took the infamous statue of the god Marduk back to Elam. Now, that wasn't enough. He also captured the victory stele of Naram Sin, essentially 1,000 years old by that point, and wrote his own inscription over it. Not only that, but he also self-inserted his image on a stele. Was this an absolute gigachad? Yeah, he sent a message and he meant it. Elam firmly wanted the Babylonian throne, and they would stop at nothing for a while. And there we go, you listen to me for ages ramble about historical characters and what makes sense as potential factions. Now, we just gotta wait and see what's gonna happen, but realistically, a lot of these have a very high chance of making it into the game, assuming we are actually getting more than one per culture. I hope you enjoyed the video. It was fun ranting and raving and discussing history as always. If you're crazy enough to like, share, or subscribe, I appreciate it. And stay tuned, there's a lot more videos to come. Until the next time...